April 23, 1945. The mountain breathes in a dim blue that makes the lamps feel farther away. The relay rack stays warm under the hand. The line toward Berlin inhales and falters, exhales and frays. Click, carrier, code, breath. A small sequence that keeps a nervous system from coming apart. An oath sits in the chest like a coin pressed against bone. Never move the set because of fear. Signals do not retreat. The sky arrives before the message. It does not come as one engine. It comes as a layered saw that moves the dust on the shelf and blurs the needles. A tearing hum slides through the room without a schedule and steals the middle out of words. A staff officer lays a form beside the pad with slow ceremony, as if paper can still command metal. A decree is a neat thing until wind pushes at the shutters. The mountain has learned to pretend that distance is a wall. The man who owns the myth of prestige has kept tokens of the neat world where rank could bend weather. Lacquered wood, hunter glass, badges that once claimed the sky had rules. The men on headsets still count fuel in minutes as if minutes can be trained. The set draws current. The braided cable grows warm under the palm. The breath finds a 5-beat rhythm that lines up with the key. The room believes that quality can hold time still. The first line carries a demand dressed as clarity. Authority speaks as if syllables can erase geography, as if a sentence born in a year of triumph can be stapled to a year of collapse. Names are recited in the proper order. Titles are set out like silver on a table. The vowels falter at the edges. The men on the switches hold their bodies quiet because they were trained to keep muscle out of signal. The second line does not carry words. It carries the wrong sky. The hum drops across the pitch like a hand on a throat. A broadband scrape erases the center of sentences and lifts the operator's eyes off the dials. The room counts breaths between passes. The count is shorter than yesterday. A pilot who cannot be seen writes his presence in dust and in a faint tremor that runs through varnish and glass. The oath is measured against the heat of the cable and the dry bite of dust when the fan hesitates. The desk smells of bakelite pressed too hard for too long. The staff officer describes a letter he has not read. A letter that imagines a path where a title can move from one hand to another and the machine of state will continue. The radio knows that words must become minutes of motion, or they do not live. A relay reports fuel in kilograms and converts to minutes of sky life. Another relay reports an absence. No fighter strength on station long enough to hold shape against the shriek. Code leaves the key wet with breath and returns with a name that thinks it can direct from a safe distance. The room tries to remember the quiet hum of a controlled net. The mountain remembers being above things. The village below remembers a road where convoys move without asking permission. Hands have been trained to be invisible. A needle rests on a mark. A heel fixes the floor. A neck finds the angle that places the ear under the cup without tremor. The sky reaches into the room and makes the body visible again. A pass shivers the mugs and opens a hairline crack in a plate under the map. The hum becomes a downbeat the room did not choose. The code tries to ride the noise and breaks into fragments like ice under weight. The voice that matters does not use adjectives. It is chalk on a board that says on station 15 Winchester at 6 divert east in 2. A line that was never invited draws a clock over the mountain and keeps it by availability. The man on the key wants to hate the chalk. It is plain. It does not carry a crest. It does not bow to pedigree. It returns again this afternoon and then again tomorrow, and it does not apologize for being simple and present. A sleeve with a neat edge requests one more pass to Berlin because legality needs to see the stamp. The man on the key counts the beats in his throat and times the transmit to a quiet gap. The gap lies. The shriek comes early. The sentence loses its middle. The title loses its dignity. The mountain loses the special silence that allowed pretense. A decree without minutes of sky is a letter addressed to no one. A rumor crosses the table. Paintings have moved. A train not listed in the book of battle carries canvases through the throat of the country while the air belongs to men who write in chalk. The rumor says pictures will survive and the perfect jet will not. The rumor says symbols can still be protected while pilots are measured in hours remaining. The relay must decide which rumor is worth minutes, because there are not enough for both. Another voice from the road says, a field is blocked by aircraft that will not lift, because fuel exists only as a number with no path. The number is not large enough to be useful. A different voice says the enemy replaces a plane in an afternoon. The enemy cares less about perfection than about coverage of the next afternoon. The desk breathes, and the men count the breaths because the breaths line up with the key. The oath burns as a small bright pain within a larger sound. An order shapes itself on the tongue like a shard. The man who swore that he would never move a set for fear hears his own voice telling the crew to pull the rack 2 rooms north and kill the longest trunk for 1 minute. He does not say the word survival. The code falls silent. Casters squeal. The braid tugs. A handful of minutes are thrown away to save the body that holds the key. Shame rises and the mountain files it under necessity. The casters stop. The set breathes again. The cable is warmer. Dust has lifted off the dial. The gap in the net writes a hole in someone else's map. The chalk voice returns above the ridge and counts the station again. The letter that believed in legality lies on the table with a torn edge and no power. The mountain learns a doctrine it does not want. What is available today decides tomorrow. Tomorrow does not read decrees. Silence returns, but it is not clean silence. It is engineered by exhaustion. The men let themselves believe it is victory silence, because belief steadies the hands. The radio begins to carry sentences that put minutes before nouns. The oath is broken. A private line appears on a pad. The best set cannot outplay a schedule it cannot alter. The sky hums once more, and does not ask pardon. Breath, click, carrier, code. The rhythm remains. The meaning has changed. Perfection without time is theatre. The room keeps time by minutes of fuel and minutes of voice, and both shrink. The staff wants a cause that preserves pride. The ledger offers something colder. A report arrives from the city that still calls itself a capital. It quotes a superior who mocks the enemy for flying crude machines. He speaks of rough rivets and mass production lines that grind out sameness. He says perfection will return to the sky in a single stroke and make the ledger blush. He says the jet is a sword, and the enemy only brings hammers. The men in the room want to believe the sword can split hours into victory. The ledger does not bow. It opens to a column where airframes become sorties. It shows that a machine that can be repaired in an afternoon returns to the war before the perfect machine can be towed from a hangar. It shows that a runway that accepts rough tires in rain returns more war than a masterpiece that waits for a clear morning. It shows that 1 day of coverage is worth more than a promise of brilliance next week. The relay lists numbers and the man translates numbers into life. Fuel measured in kilograms becomes minutes of sky. Oil measured in litres becomes minutes of engine heat before the bearing complains. Tires measured in pairs become landings before a blowout turns a plane into freight. Spares measured in crates become how many pilots can keep their times. The enemy stacks crates near the line. The crates look ugly. The time they provide is beautiful. A staff voice repeats the word quality and means prestige. The ledger repeats the word availability and means presence. The two words meet over a mountain and do not agree about what a day is for. The staff wants the day to display authority. The ledger wants the day to be full of returns to station. The sky decides by listening to who shows up on time. The jet that should redeem the story sits on trestles. Its skin gleams. Its intake edges are clean and thin. The engine asks for fuel that no longer moves on schedule. The runway asks for distance that no longer exists. The pilot asks for a window that no longer stays open. The enemy does not ask for windows. The enemy keeps a wheel on the air every hour the weather allows, and often when it does not. The enemy decides that rough is a price worth paying if the clock keeps moving. The room smells of bakelite and warm dust, and a faint sweetness from tired insulation. A messenger breathes hard in the doorway and lays down a list of field repairs performed on the other side of the lines during one long day. It reads like a grocery list. It is not poetic. It lists a tire change, a spark plug swap, a panel reseated with a strip of cloth to stop a rattle, a drop tank fitted, then another, then another. The list ends with a sentence written without pride. Aircraft return to station in 3 hours. The man on the key reads the sentence twice because it weighs more the second time. An old speech from a higher office says that central control ensures order. Today, central control ensures delay. Orders move down a long corridor and meet a staircase without light. A field chief on the other side of the war moves a unit 2 fields over and is airborne again before the corridor finds a stamp. The enemy rules by short distances and short decisions. A promise of speed that depends on a long permission chain is not speed. It is theatre. The staff tries to reclaim the story. They point at the jet and say that one pass from perfection breaks a formation and sets the day right. The ledger measures what happens after the one pass. The enemy does not stop flying because one pass was clean. The enemy increases escort depth and changes the hour of rendezvous. The enemy absorbs the loss and returns in the afternoon with a fresh layer. The perfect pass becomes one detail inside a day that continues to move. The day does not salute the detail. A man on the net quotes a maintenance chief who laughs at the word masterpiece. The chief says a masterpiece that cannot be turned around before dusk is a museum piece. He says the only masterpieces that mattered this spring were the ones that drank from a barrel without complaint and let a greasy crew touch everything without fear of breaking a jewel. He says that every new part that fits without filing gives back minutes, and minutes are all that a pilot can spend. The rumour of paintings on a train returns walking on quieter feet. The rumour is a mirror. Symbols are evacuated with care. Pilots are not. The room does not say the word priorities. The ledger says it for them by placing a date next to a train and a blank next to a squadron that is waiting for fuel. The blank is not an accident. It is a philosophy written in absence. A courier brings a note that explains why the fuel did not arrive. Bridges gone, rail spurs cut. A depot struck by a wave of bombers that did not require perfect aim because there were many of them and because proximity fuses have made the air itself hostile to anything that rises to fight. The note says the jet will stand down until a new route is found. The enemy does not stand down. The enemy shifts traffic along roads made for farm wagons and accepts dust in the intake as a fair trade. The room draws a line between industrial theory and the body. The line is simple. A plane that exists and can fly today is worth more than a better plane that cannot. A pilot who returns to the circuit after a field fix will be on station when the order arrives. An order that arrives on time is worth more than a brilliant order that arrives after the sky has moved on. A radio that hums in the presence of noise is worth more than a perfect quiet line that goes dark whenever the wrong hum passes overhead. The men remember winter speeches about decisive weapons. They look at spring logs that show cumulative presence. The speeches promised control. The logs show rhythm. The enemy wins by rhythm and by the refusal to pause. The enemy builds machines that accept rough hands, trains crews that change parts fast, and places stocks close enough to the line that a truck can make the trip, even when the rail map turns into a collection of holes. The enemy dives into the untidy. The room has been taught to fear the untidy. The man on the key hears himself counting in a new way. Not one jet, one strike, one victory. 1 hour covered, then another hour, then another, until night draws a slow curtain. The ledger agrees. An hour on station is a brick. A day filled with bricks becomes a wall. A wall built of hours is heavier than a single perfect spear. The spear glitters. The wall stands. A memory of the early war presses in the pride in machining tolerances and the way a bearing hummed when adjusted by a master. That pride has not died. It has simply learned that it must serve a different master. The bearing must turn for as many hours as the schedule demands, not as many hours as the craftsman wishes. The craftsman still matters. He matters when his work supports return and return again. Another list arrives. It tallies machine availability by field, not by factory. It shows that a modest airframe with simple systems appears over the line more often than a superior airframe with delicate needs. It shows that a simple cockpit makes a new pilot faster. It shows that a part that can be swapped with a wrench at the edge of a field removes a phone call to a city. It shows that time is saved in many small places and spent in one large action called coverage. The staff officer who loves the look of a decree reads the lists without looking up. The lists do not care about his posture. He asks for a phrase he can send upward that will satisfy a mind still devoted to prestige. The man on the quay offers a phrase that is not flattering. The phrase says that the enemy has paid for presence with ugliness and repetition, and has been repaid with control of the daylight. The phrase lands on the table like a tool with no polish. The sky writes the conclusion over the ridge before anyone signs a paper. Fighters that are plain and serviceable cover another hour in layers. Bombers follow a timetable that resembles a train schedule more than a duel. Repair trucks move with an indifference to elegance. There is noise, and then there is more noise, and the pattern inside the noise is attendance. The room tries one more time to imagine a rescue by perfection. The imagination cannot find a rail line that reaches. It cannot find fuel that moves free of interruption. It cannot find a permission chain that is shorter than the enemy's road network. It cannot find a window that stays open long enough for a single perfect blow to matter more than a whole day built from returns. The ledger closes on a sentence that the room does not want to speak aloud. Availability outperforms perfection because it controls time. The sentence is not poetry. It is a rule that was there from the first hour and has become visible only now when the walls are thin and the clock has grown loud. The man on the quay writes the rule on the pad in small letters. He does not sign it. He does not need to. The sky signs it with another pass that arrives on time. Dawn folds over the ridge in thin bands, and the room takes its shape from lamps and paper. The plan is a narrow blade. It has names, headings, climb rates, and a window measured in minutes. The mountain will feed one formation into one corridor and cut once. The relay hums. The braided cable warms. The oath about precision feels almost clean again. A weather voice speaks in a careful monotone. Ceiling enough. Visibility enough. Crosswind rising after first light. The schedule slides into place like a drawer. A controller on the net counts down a climb and reads a heading. Pilots answer with clipped calm that sounds like it belongs to an earlier year. A ground crew out on the strip counts liters into tanks and taps gauges with knuckles. The jet that has been polished like an argument rolls toward the light. The line through the air is straight. The vector is tidy. The first pass is planned to be slashing and short. Speed will do the work that numbers cannot. Adler leans into the headset until the rubber seals around his thought. He hears the whisper of intake and the hiss of airframe at a speed that feels like an oath fulfilled. He hears the guns open. The sky draws a brief bruise where a bomber falls out of shape. For a moment the ledger smiles. One pass, one machine broken, one promise kept. The room lets out a held breath that becomes 2 breaths, and then 3. A sleeve smooths a corner on a map. A pencil circles a point as if a circle could anchor a day. The jet arcs away at a pace that makes pursuit absurd. The circuit calls for altitude, and the pilot answers with a voice that is all edges and no tremor. The second minute is not like the first. The corridor fills with voices that are not on this plan. They speak in a different grammar. They stack times like bricks. On station, relieve, climb, push. Each word is small and heavy. Another escort layer arrives as if the ridge itself has multiplied into the air. The return pass shrinks to a sliver. The glide slope home becomes a path that must cross moving teeth. A glint slides across the slope, and then another. The hum that has no schedule writes a line through the room and erases half a sentence. The jet that had been a blade becomes a body that must land. The calendar of the enemy does not respect the grace that a landing requires. The strip that was supposed to be a sanctuary turns into a straight line that cannot dodge. Adler hears the tower count a wind shift and then hears a note in the controller's throat that he has never heard before. The flak pieces draw their arcs, but the air is treacherous now. Proximity fuses make height a fuse and time a trigger. A swarm of fragments hangs where a clean shell used to pass and miss. The geometry that once protected a precise approach dissolves into a general threat. The jet skirts the edge of the pattern and throws the plan away. To live, it must accept imperfection. To live, it must accept a landing that does not look proud. Adler marks the line where uptime should be and watches the minutes drain. Metric Y loses shape. Every burst that wanders through the band writes hiss over the signal and grows another second of silence. He moves the dial by a finger's width and recovers a syllable, then loses the rest of the word. He counts how often he is counting. He thinks of the oath. He thinks of the way shame tastes like the iron in old water. The perfect pass has done its perfect work, and yet the day grows heavier rather than lighter. The enemy does not pause to admire either loss or rescue. A fresh flight takes a layer that was occupied by smoke a moment ago. A bomber box closes a gap as if guided by hydraulics rather than will. The escorts dive and climb in a cycle that has no center. The day is not a duel. The day is a schedule. A pilot calls the field with heat in the voice. The call is not fear. It is a calculation shouted across metal and air. Fuel minutes are now few. Gear must come down soon. The strip is littered with debris from an earlier attempt to keep dignity. A truck scrapes canvas across a wing to hide glare. A crewman kneels in dirt to lay a panel so a tire does not bite a hole. A small thing buys a life. The ledger nods. The intercept map glows with pencils and with hope. The second jet makes a clean entry and a tight turn, then finds itself inside a web. The web is a rhythm, not a trap made of wire. A controller, half a valley away, hands off a vector faster than the mountain can decide whether to speak. The enemy does not seek a single blow. The enemy seeks attendance. The enemy is present in the next 10 minutes, and in the 10 after that. The room tries to help with the only tool it has. It speaks. It asks for one more sliver of quiet between waves. The quiet does not arrive. The wrong hum drags across the band, and the needles waver. A man at the far end of the table holds his headset with both hands, as if the extra pressure will force words to obey. Adler watches the clock and calculates how many orders will die before they touch a cockpit. The number is not dramatic. It is simply too large. The heavy machines that filled speeches in the winter look smaller in the spring light. Their greatness depended on skies that would pause to admire. The sky now is full of work. Work arrives with the sound of trucks that never quite stop. Work makes ugliness into currency. Work turns a crewman with a wrench into a factor of survival equal to a signature on a glossy plan. A rebuilt jet screams down the valley late, beautiful, committed. It throws a line of fire through a formation and peels away with its skin intact. Applause rises unspoken. It will need another landing. It will need a window that no longer holds. It will need a circuit free of sudden teeth. The day refuses to be shaped by ceremony. The day judges by attendance per hour and by the refusal to become tired. Adler shifts to a reserve channel and steals back a minute of uptime. He rides that minute like a narrow bridge. He passes a heading and a height. He is proud of the steadiness in his voice. The next pass of the wrong hum lifts the bridge from under him. He writes down a rate of loss because counting is what keeps his hands from shaking. He writes down minutes like a medic writes down pulse. The numbers do not lie for him. They do not lie for anyone. A transport low in the valley tries to move fuel by road because the rail map has become a sieve. It crawls through bends that were made for cattle and hay. It arrives late, with just enough to fill one squadron to a fraction. A decision follows. Which jets will rise? Which jets will wait? The plan had promised a series of knives. The reality produces a small hammer that hits the same board all day. The enemy remembers to be boring. That is the hardest art. A plane fighter that climbs and relieves. A drop tank that goes on without complaint. A plug that threads without argument. A pilot who stands up, drinks water and flies again. The mountain had believed in heroes. The day believes in shifts. The day believes in return. Before noon, a precise tactic is repeated with even greater care. The approach is clean. The pass draws smoke. A claim is logged. The log is a thin consolation that gets thinner when the return routes bloom with threats in every altitude. A field chief on the far net moves his ready section to a strip 2 valleys over and covers the gap while the first strip is dressed. He does it without making a speech. He does it with a truck and with a phone that never sits on a velvet pad. Adler feels pride and grief at the same time. Pride at the craft that still cuts when it gets the chance. Grief that the chance grows smaller each hour as presence turns the sky into a fabric. He thinks about the winter and about the articles that promised decisive edges and about the ceiling that would host a pure duel. He writes instead a crude ratio that he has learned to trust. Hours covered to number of blows. He underlines the first term because it feeds the second. Afternoon light leans across the table and makes paper look older. The jet that was saved in the morning sits on trestles again. The crew works quickly. Quick is not quick enough for a schedule that has forgotten courtesy. Another pass of the unseen arrives early. Another minute disappears. Another order breaks into syllables and dies on the lip of the ether. The day has decided, but the room must arrive there on its own feet. Precision has not failed because it is false. Precision has failed because it is alone. It needed a chorus, and it has a solo. The enemy did not bother to sing in tune. The enemy filled the hall with simple voices and counted time out loud until the lone violin could not be heard. At last the plan for evening proposes one more careful cut. Adler studies the timing and the arcs and the fuel lines on the map. He sees the beauty. He sees the risk. He sees the missing minutes that will be stolen by a hum that has learned his schedule. He thinks of the oath again and of the casters under the rack. He does not move yet. He writes a single line on the pad to keep his mind from drifting. Discipline without abundance becomes waste. The ridge darkens by slow degrees. The wrong hum fades and returns and fades again. The relay keeps breathing. The cable stays warm under the palm. The plan still glitters on paper. The sky still prefers attendance. The wrong hum arrives before light and never leaves. It slides through the rafters and into the teeth. It drags grit across the dial. It grabs the middle out of words and leaves only edges. The room breathes in short counts and loses the count. A runner from the strip shouts from the doorway and has to shout again because the first shout is eaten. A jet rolled, a tire bit at the edge of the panel. The wing scraped and did not tear. The crew swarmed it with canvas and with rope and with hands that do not ask for permission. The pilot walked away with knees shaking and eyes dry. He will fly again in hours. The sentence lands like a verdict on pride. Hours, not days. Adler holds the cup to his ear until the skin aches. He lines his breathing to the tick that still cuts through the smear. The whole net is a narrow bridge. He gives a heading. He gives a height. He gives the word wait with a tone that pretends authority can still stretch a minute. The minute breaks under the weight. A gust of dust moves along the floor at ankle height when the next passes rake the slope. The lamps go thin and return. The needles hunt. The old quiet of the mountain is gone, and the new quiet is the pause between blows. The men in the room hold their bodies still as if stillness could change physics. He asks for a second set on the reserve trunk, and hears himself in a register that sounds like an apology. The reserve trunk exists as a line on a map and as a wish in his throat. The line is there. The wish is not enough. The hum throws a sheet over the vowels and carries on as if the set is a box of air. The oath comes up like taste. Never move the set because of fear. Never cut the trunk because cutting the trunk is a small treason against order. He has bent it once. He has named the bend necessity. The sky insists on a second. The insistence is a body push. It comes with a visible pressure that makes paper lift at the corners and that makes mugs creep by a finger width across the table. A call cuts through from the strip in broken stairs of syllables. The repaired plane has lifted. The crew took its belly apart with knives and tape and put it back together with speed that would have been punished in a quieter year. It rose ugly and full of life. A second machine that carries prestige on its skin waits for a window that does not stay open. The room hears the math inside those two sentences and looks away. Another pass, closer, lower. The bad pitch writes a straight line down the length of the room. A pane cracks. The men flinch like schoolboys and regret it at once. The staff officer with the neat sleeve tries to make his pen touch paper while the table moves. He scratches an oval that should be a signature and lifts the pen with a look that should be private. Adler feels the urge to step out and see the sky with his eyes. He stays. Seeing will not alter the bridge of sound that he must walk. He reaches for the switch that cuts the longest trunk and stops his hand in mid-air. He hears his oath say, no. He hears the wrong hum say, now. He cuts the trunk. The click is small and absolute. The room takes a breath around it. A desk fan changes its tone. A man at the back closes his eyes as if a blade has gone through him. Adler hears his own voice continue without colour. He orders the rack moved one more room to the north and 2 doors deeper. He orders the codes lifted. He orders the heavy spares left behind. He orders a kit that will keep the bridge alive and leaves prestige for the men who speak of museums. Casters complain. Cables tug like veins. The braid bites his palm and leaves a tacky heat on skin. Dust rises and enters the throat. The move adds seconds to the silence, and seconds are now a currency that he spent without order. Shame becomes physical. It sits on the tongue like iron and on the ribs like a weight. He feels smaller than his set. The wrong hum moves on for a handful of heartbeats, and the gap becomes a lake. He runs across it with 2 words that a pilot will understand. Divert west. Hold low. The words are not beautiful. They are not lawful in the old way. They live because they arrive. He hears the pilot reply with a sound that is more exhale than language. He hears landing gear come down in a voice that cannot hide its metal. Silence returns in a brittle layer that will not support its own weight. Men walk in the space as if it could break under boots. The set breathes, the needles settle. The cable under his hand cools by a fraction and holds that fraction like relief. A fuel truck in the valley radios in with a sentence that contains every part of the war. The truck has reached the strip with enough to fill a few machines to a portion. The driver lists obstacles as if making a litany. Bridge out. Road soft. A crater used as a pool for livestock yesterday, now a clue to tempo. The truck unloads with men standing guard who watch the slope for glints instead of the sky for clouds. Adler writes 2 numbers with care, as if a neat hand can make them kinder. Minutes to turn. Minutes on station. He looks at the ratio and knows that it is the heartbeat of this season. He thinks of a museum with a single perfect piece kissed by light. He writes a different sentence for a different museum. The day will keep only those tools that served the clock. The hum returns with a thicker edge. It behaves like weather that has learned to hate. Windows bow. The strip lies flat and helpless under it. A rescue crew runs a canvas across the nose of a waiting plane to break a line of sight that should not matter, and yet sometimes does. A flak piece tries to reach, and only seeds the air with hazards that are as dangerous to friend as to foe. Proximity has made altitude a rumour. He orders again. Shorter words, stronger verbs. He feels the doctrine slip from his voice the way a stone slips from a cold hand. He tells himself that he will pick it up later. That is a lie he tells to keep standing. The room already knows that later will not come in the shape he wants. A form arrives from a higher office. It accuses by the simple act of existing. It wants signatures and countersignatures, and wants them to carry a mask of calm. It binds authority to a title that feels like a coin from another kingdom. It repeats the fantasy that an elegant plan can travel by paper while the sky keeps still. Adler signs for receipt without reading the clauses. The signature looks like a surrender and feels like a necessity. A second runner from the strip cannot keep the joy out of his voice. The patched machine has landed, taken fuel, and gone up again. The words are tired and bright. They carry a math lesson that no one wanted. Hours, not days. Liters into minutes, grease into survival, tape into endurance. The ugly has become a sacred colour. The room looks at the jet that waits for a perfect window. It shines, its skin is exact, its inlet lip could teach a class in purity. The men in the room have loved what it represents. They do not stop loving it. They simply learn that love cannot pay for time. A mechanic takes off his cap and sets it on the table as if the act could slow a clock. Adler moves the cap aside so a map can stay flat. He lowers his voice and calls a field 2 valleys over. He asks for a slot there. He receives a sentence that has no ceremony. Bring what you can carry, and do not bring pride. He says yes at once. He has learned the new language. He cuts the last thin comfort out of the net and organizes the lift. He sends the young operators first because their hands still shake. He stays. He cannot give that up yet. He cannot let go of the bridge until someone else is across. The wrong hum comes back with the weight of metal on metal. He feels it in his teeth and in the joints of his fingers. He thinks of winter again and of how clean the air could sound when a network held. He tastes the difference between a vow and a ritual. The vow was to keep men alive by keeping meaning moving. The ritual was to keep beauty intact while they did it. The vow is the thing that survives. The ritual is the thing he now breaks. A call slashes in from a pilot who sounds older than he did at dawn. He reports damage to one wing and to the skin near the gear. He is steady. He is also honest. He will try again in a short time because the crew can turn his bird in hours. He says the word hours without shame. Adler feels the word settle like a stone that supports rather than crushes. He dictates a short entry for the daybook. He chooses words that a stranger can read after the room is cold. He writes that the rack was moved to preserve service and that the long trunk was cut by design. He writes that the choice cost minutes and saved lives. He writes that an oath was bent to protect its substance. He does not write the taste in his mouth. The mountain falls into a half-light that turns every surface into paper. The set ticks, the bridge holds, the sky keeps its schedule, not his. He has lost the vanity that told him effort could rule time. He keeps the craft that lets him make 1 minute into meaning when the gap opens. He looks at his pad. He writes the sentence he has avoided. Skill without schedule is a gesture. He writes the second sentence because the first requires it. Survival belongs to what returns when asked. He stares at the words until the wrong hum moves through them and does not make them untrue. A fresh wave arrives over the ridge and the shelf shakes. He closes his eyes and sees the repaired plane leaping forward with a belly that bears the marks of knives and tape. He sees a jet shining and waiting. He knows which one the day favors. He knows which one a museum would choose. He knows which choice keeps the sky from being owned by someone else. He opens his eyes and speaks into the dark air of the room. He orders another cut. He orders another move. He orders another small death for a beautiful system that cannot live in this hour. The words are simple. The words are clean. The words taste of iron and relief. Shame remains. So does the network. So does the lesson that has been teaching itself all morning while men argued with it. Availability beats perfection because it owns minutes. He does not say it aloud. The sky says it for him, by arriving again right on time. Evening folds into the room and leaves a soft glaze on metal. Heat drains from the walls. The set breathes. The men speak less and listen more. The day has written on every surface, and the ink is a fine dust that glows under the lamps. Adler steps out with a runner when the pass is thin. The slope smells of pine and of burned oil. A repaired machine taxis with a wobble that looks like a limp and still holds its line. The crew walks beside it and keeps hands close to panels, as if hands can lend balance. A mechanic pats the skin near the gear with a flat palm and nods once. The nod says the thing will rise again before the moon is high. Hours. Always hours. The hangar keeps 2 altars, one to beauty, one to return. The first altar is the jet lifted on trestles that gleam. The intake lip is clean as a knife and cool against the wrist. The metal holds the night and gives it back in a faint chill. The seams are tight. The skin is a lecture in how to make air behave. The crew stands at a respectful distance, as if breath alone could scratch it. The second altar is a pile that would shame any parade. A captured drop tank with scuffs and hand marks sits open on its cradle. Straps hang like tired tongues. A tool roll with canvas stained by solvent lies beside it. Wrenches spread like bones. Tape sticks to the edge of a crate where a name was once written and has been rubbed away by hard fingers. There is a smell of fuel and of the sweet bite of solvent that says speed. The speed of hands. The speed of return. Adler puts the back of his knuckles to the jet's intake again. He says nothing. He steps to the drop tank and traces a line where dents have been hammered out by someone who did not have time to be delicate. He lifts the flap of the tool roll and runs a thumb over the imprint of a socket where canvas has learned the shape of work. He feels the difference move up through his arm. Cold perfection, warm use. A young pilot sits on a step and drinks water as if water is a new invention. His face is grey with dust, but his eyes are bright and ordinary. Nothing holy. He says one sentence that falls into the hangar and lies there without echo. The field crew made me flyable in 3 hours. He does not speak of heroics. He speaks of hours. He wipes his mouth with the back of his hand and stands because the voice in his head has called him back to the flight line. The staff officer with the neat sleeve does not enter the hangar. He waits in the doorway as if the dark inside is a boundary he will not cross. He has a form that wants a signature and a sentence that wants a witness. None of it weighs as much as the tool roll. Adler opens his notebook and turns to a clean page. He writes as if each letter is a careful step on a narrow ledge. Fuel in litres to minutes, oil in litres to minutes, tyres in pairs to landings, spares in crates to returns. He itemizes waste, he itemizes shame, he itemizes a day in which beauty kept asking for conditions and use kept forgiving the lack of them. He touches the jet a third time, this time with the flat of his hand. The skin answers with nothing. The thing is asleep until a corridor opens that may never open again. He knows it is not the jet's fault. He knows that fault lies in a chain that stretched itself thin for the pleasure of being fine. He lets his hand rest there until the cool fades and then steps away. A crew chief from the other side of the war would call the drop tank ugly and good. Adler hears the word good in his own head and does not fight it. The tank offers range without ceremony. It gives a pilot a longer hour. It gives a schedule more reach. It ignores pride. It answers to time. He walks the length of the hangar and counts with his breath. On every fifth step he stops and writes a number. Minutes on station for the machines that rose today. Minutes of silence caused by the wrong hum. Minutes lost to a form that went hunting for a signature instead of a spare. He draws a thin line under the set and does the sum with the point of the pencil. The sum is an admission disguised as arithmetic. Outside, the repaired plane lifts again. The sound swells and then thins as it climbs along the spine of the valley. The note is not pure, it leans. It carries tape and quick fixes into a sky that has declared its preference for presence. The jet on trestles does not move. The two sounds do not argue. They simply define the hour. Adler returns to the room with the set. He sits. He lays the notebook open beside the key and places the pencil where his hand can find it without looking. He writes a short entry for the daybook and chooses his words the way a medic chooses where to cut away a sleeve. He keeps it clean and keeps it true. He writes that a perfect platform performed a perfect pass and that the day did not move. He writes that a patched machine returned twice and that the route to twice was paved by hands that worked without permission. He writes that the wrong hum stole words and that the network lived by moving itself rather than waiting for the sky to grow courteous. He writes that minutes were the coin and that they were spent in small purchases that added up to control. He stops. He listens. The set hums with a patience that feels like pity. He turns a dial by a degree and slides across a sheer face of noise until a voice appears that carries bearings and an altitude. The voice ends with a timestamp in plain speech and a calm that has learned itself out in truck camps and in fields. He copies the words with a hand that no longer shakes. A faint scent of hot bakelite lifts out of the panel and mixes with dust. He remembers winter pride in craftsmanship and does not smother it. He moves it. He sets it down beside a new pride in the speed of a socket on a stubborn nut. The echo between the two prides is not mockery. It is a lesson written in the way lungs learn a new rhythm after a long climb. He pulls a sheet toward him and begins a private note that is not meant for the daybook. He dates it in words. He removes rank and writes his name without a title. He writes in a voice that belongs to a man in a room rather than to a uniform. He writes that perfection was a vow to build something worthy of the sky. He writes that the vow was kept by many and kept well. He writes that the war changed the price of worth. He writes that worth is counted now by returns by hours covered by how fast a crew can make a wound into a scar that holds under strain. He writes that his oath to keep signal ahead of fear has been bent twice today, and that the bend preserved the substance. He writes that he will bend it again when the wrong hum comes back, because the vow that matters has always been to make meaning travel while men are alive to receive it. He pauses and lets the pencil rest. He looks at the sentence that wants to be the end and does not rush it. He thinks of the intake lip under his palm. He thinks of the tool roll under his thumb. He thinks of the drop tank with the dent that shrugs and still gives miles. He thinks of minutes as breath and of breath as the only permission that counts. He writes the end. without flourish. He writes that the final sum of fuel to minutes and of uptime to orders shows a cost that was hidden inside a philosophy he loved. He writes that the waste was not an accident, but a feature of a belief that placed beauty before schedule and pedigree before presence. He writes that he is done lying to himself about that. A murmur rises on the net. The chalk voice returns with a list that feels like the beat of a heart. On station, relieve, climb, push. He copies it down and touches the numbers as if they are warm. The wrong hum flirts with the band and then slides off into a lower valley. He takes the gift and fills it with a vector and a height. He closes the private page and tucks it deep. He does not tear it out. He wants it to wait where only he will find it when the room is empty. He sets his hand on the cable and feels the mild heat that means life is being moved. He looks up and finds the staff officer in the doorway again. The man holds the form as if a pen will make it important. Adler signs in a plain hand and leaves the flourish behind. The flourish belongs to the jet on trestles. The plain hand belongs to the crew that will add an hour to the sky. He returns to the key and makes the next minute useful. The day tightens to the circle of the lamp and the reach of the voice. The lesson settles its weight without drama. Beauty matters. It will matter again when the clock is kind. Tonight the clock is the only command that holds. Minutes are the law. Minutes decide who is present at the end of a sentence. Minutes turn craft into survival. He speaks once more into the band. He uses short words and strong verbs. He does not look at the jet. He does not need to. He has touched both altars and has chosen the one that pays. Night thins to a pale seam behind the ridge, and the room holds its breath for the first clear sentence. The set hums like something patient and old. Paper edges curl a little in the damp. The men wait for the sky to choose a voice. The war has taught a grammar that is not elegant. It is built of returns. It is built of hands that turn wrenches and of trucks that move when rails are broken. It is built of hours stitched together until a day becomes a wall. The wall is not beautiful. It stands. Adler reads his notebook with the slowness of someone who has learned to distrust wishful speed. He sees the line where fuel became minutes and where minutes became presence. He sees the other line where forms became pauses and where pauses became loss. He does not look away. He lets the lines do what lines do when drawn straight. The larger world presses in without asking. Cities that once hosted ceremony now host schedules. Airfields that once saluted pedigree now salute attendance. A jet that needs a perfect lane to matter becomes a story told at dinner. A plane fighter that accepts rough hands becomes the hour itself. The mountain understands at last that distance never was a bunker. Distance was a delay. A historian voice wanders through the future and sets down a measure with quiet authority. Readiness per hour, coverage per day, turnaround as a moral, the vocabulary changes, the truth does not. What arrives on time writes the map, what returns again redraws it. The fear that hid in Adler's oath shows its face and turns out to be simple. It was the fear that craft would be made small by schedule. It was the fear that a man who loved a flawless edge would have to kneel to time. He kneels. He finds that kneeling is not surrender. It is alignment. He remembers the intake lip under his palm. He remembers the tool roll under his thumb. He does not place them in opposition anymore. He places them in sequence. Make it well. Keep it flying. Keep it flying again. The second command rescues the first from becoming an exhibit. Spring will end the war. The lesson will not end with it. Factories will learn to count in alive minutes. Depots will learn to place crates where dust gets into boots. Headquarters will learn a new kind of sentence that spends fewer syllables and more time. Glare will fade from polished metal. A quiet pride will rise from parts that fit without filing. A staff officer enters with a paper that wants a signature as proof of order. Adler signs because signatures still move some doors. He does not imagine that ink can move the sky. The sky has moved on to a different authority. It accepts only attendance and does not negotiate the rate. The radio lifts a voice that speaks in the new creed without drama. On station. Relieve. Climb. Push. He copies the words as if copying a prayer. He does not feel smaller when he writes them. He feels placed inside a machine that values him because he gives it minutes. The feeling is not glory. There is room in this doctrine for beauty that earns its keep. There is room for craft that lowers a failure rate by 1 in 10 and returns one more pilot to the circuit before dusk. There is no room for prestige that waits for a window and calls the waiting discipline. The window closes. The ledger does not. Across years to come, men will speak about this spring and argue over names. They will say that the jet should have commanded the age. They will say that a single perfect blow ought to have decided a sky. The records will answer with counts that do not tire. Sorties per day, hours covered, losses absorbed without pause. The counts will end the argument without raising a voice. He writes one last line into the notebook where he has tallied fuel and silence and return. He allows himself a sentence that fuses the cold of arithmetic with the heat he has carried behind his ribs. Resource per minute. He underlines it once. It is not poetry. It is a vow for a different era. The ridge brightens by degrees and shows the strip as a long scar that still heals in public. A repaired aircraft lifts with an honest noise. A shine sits on trestles and waits for a day that does not exist. The choice has been made by a clock that cares nothing for ceremony. Availability beat perfection because it owned time. The words stand in the air between the men and the set like a beam that does not need decoration. The room does not cheer. The room gets to work. He closes the notebook and keeps the pencil ready. He rests his hand on the braided cable and feels life as a mild warmth that refuses to pretend. The fear has become acceptance. The acceptance has become instruction. What is present today will decide tomorrow. What returns will inherit the sky. Breath, click, carrier, code. The rhythm remains. The meaning is firm now. The doctrine that lost has not been mocked. It has been weighed. The doctrine that won must be kept honest by the same scale. Minutes are the law. Minutes fused to material make the final number that carries both data and feeling. He writes it one more time in a hand that no longer shakes. Resource per minute.